Hello, I'm Kurt Geisenger, and I am recording a presentation for the APA Symposium with David McKinnon and Eric Youngstrom. I'm Kurt Geisenger. The topic I'm going to be talking about is testing individuals with disabilities, and I'm talking primarily about testing people with disabilities who are taking cognitive tests, such as admissions tests or educational achievement tests, things like that. And to introduction, what we need to say is that all individuals are entitled to accommodations if they have disabilities. And there was a time early after the ADA passed in 1990 when many individuals were requesting individual accommodations. But now we know that a certain set of accommodations can be used for many people with disabilities. And the most common and the most controversial is extra time. Now, I can tell you on the SAT and the GRE back after the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 passed, which put conditions on admissions tests, that people were given essentially unlimited time. They could take it until the end of the day, basically. But now you most typically get either 50% or 100% extra. And there was a time when many of the standardized tests, if they gave you accommodations, they gave you a little asterisk after your score saying that you had some sort of accommodation, and that told people that you didn't take it under standardized conditions. And almost all companies have now stopped that. And that can be a real issue for long tests. At one point, I think the SAT went to 4.5 hours. Now imagine if you got 100% extra time, you would not want to take a test for 9 hours in a day. And so it was actually split across 2 days. And this becomes rather difficult for longer tests. Now, while ADA requires accommodations, some people in testing have differentiated accommodations and modifications. I'm going to be talking about that in a minute. But what you will see is in most cases, this is a judgment call over whether it's an accommodation or a modification. And what I'm going to talk about is really the principles of the two. Now, the question is, first, who has a disability? IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which I think I have the years for it coming up in a later slide, but that listed 4 primary categories: speech language impairment, serious emotional disturbances, mental retardation, and serious learning disabilities. And they are not necessarily what we think of first when we think of disabilities. We're thinking obviously of people with visual disabilities, auditory, movement orders, or that they have multiple disabilities all at the same time. But those tend to have many smaller, they're much smaller groups. The 4 that are listed in IDEA are the 4 that are more common. Now, with regard to accommodations, if something is an accommodation, we believe that it's removing construct irrelevant variance. In other words, there's something that a person with a disability can't do as well. If you're in a wheelchair and it's a walking test, obviously there's no way to really fix that, but we're trying to eliminate construct irrelevant variance. So it may be for someone who is blind, they get Braille, or for someone with a visual disability, they get a larger print or a better print, conceivably. And some of these things are easier on paper and pencil, some of them are easier on computer. And basically, we're providing access to materials that otherwise people couldn't do. And there are some things that are really quite difficult. So if you have a test of map reading for someone with a visual disability, actually, I know that educational testing services spend a huge amount of money developing maps that someone could feel with their hand, but it really is something different. And we'll give some other examples of that later. But the 3 attributes that we believe make something an accommodation is that it alters the presentation or response mode to provide a person with a disability with access to the test, that it doesn't change the tested construct. So we still believe it's the same thing that we're measuring. And usually we have what we call differential access, sometimes differential gain. that we have score increases for those who receive the accommodation that we don't necessarily get for people who don't need the accommodation. And that's a question Susan Phillips, a lawyer psychologist, actually asked, how would normal test takers benefit if they received the accommodation? And then we look at the reliability and validity of the accommodation information, or the, and so forth. Now, modifications, this is where we believe the construct is somehow being changed, and it involves usually a significant change in the test. So this would be from taking a reading test to having someone read it to you. Now, what's interesting is I've given a talk, a longer talk than this in many circumstances, and one of the issues is I'll ask people, if you take a reading test for someone who's blind and you put it into Braille, is that still a reading test? And I've given this to psychologists, and 95+% will say that reading a book in Braille is the same as reading a book with your eyes. And then I say, is listening to that same tape of a book also reading? And that is, of course, the main way that many people with visual disabilities read books. And people say, no, that's not reading now, that's hearing, because we've differentiated it. Now, we also would have a modification if it's a highly speeded test and we're giving someone almost unlimited time. That would be something that really does change the nature of the test conceivably. And when we have a modification, we don't always interpret the scores the same as though they're normal. It may be that the only alternative to not making a modification is not to test the person. And so that's what modification is. But again, it's a judgment call whether it's an accommodation or a modification. We don't necessarily have enough empirical research to justify making that as an empirical decision. Now, if we want to make test alterations, again, we're looking for an unchanged construct that is removing speededness, removing reading from a mathematics assessment. That's something that actually makes sense for foreign language people sometimes as well. We must have individual need, that is, we're not just trying to help someone get a higher score, we're helping them to get a more valid score. We're looking for that differential effect, that jump, and a sameness of inference. So if a blind person takes a test with large print or Braille, and usually if you need either one of those accommodations, you almost have to have extra time, because if you have to turn more pages because of the large print, and Braille reading is much slower, you have to give people more time as well. But we want to be able to look at the scores and make the same kind of inferences about them. Now, the biggest source of validity information on people with disabilities comes from admissions tests. That's where we see it the most. And the goal, as I said, of accommodations is to assure a valid assessment, but they sometimes can add extraneous variance too. If you're giving somebody too much time, maybe it gives them an inflated score. If you're giving them too little time, it gives them an underestimated score. And so across states, on statewide testing, there is sometimes an inconsistent application of accommodation rules, and that would cause extraneous variance if you looked at the scores nationally. And there's relatively little accommodations research. There's actually been some good literature reviews, but it's interesting when you get into that literature, much of what you read is anecdotal or case studies, and we're looking for bigger studies. Anymore, we have, for example, read aloud accommodations, and we have mostly positive validity results, that tests are more valid with the accommodations than they are without the accommodations. There's quite a bit of research on that using admissions tests, and it makes sense. I mean, think about a paper and pencil or a computer-based test that someone who has a visual disability can't see or read, but if they get it in Braille, or they get it in large print, or they get it orally, suddenly it could make it more valid. Similarly, imagine someone with a very bad movement disorder. If they had to try to pencil in all their answers on a multiple choice test, it just doesn't make sense, and it adds tremendously to the stress and to the time. So with regard to test presentation and administration, we can do large type, read aloud, computers, calculators, pacing issues, and give people more time. We can change the language sometimes for people if they're from a different country and speak a different language. Or even, I've seen that even for some disabilities, to use simpler language for people who have learning disabilities or a developmental delay. And then we have to ask questions like, how does the student normally read? And if they're using large type, that's one thing. If they're using tapes, or they're getting books on tape, that's another. Can the student follow directions? We need to know that. Does the student normally use computers? Some people with disabilities have very little computer use experience, although that is largely fading away. And we want to know how someone's tested in the classroom. And one of the things we worry about, and I'm a strong advocate for people with disabilities, but we worry about people who don't have a disability throughout most of their life, and then they get up to taking a college admissions test or a law board or something like that, and suddenly they say, oh, I have a disability, I'm learning disabled, I need extra time. And in a sense, we want people with real disabilities, but we also don't want to just offer those accommodations to anybody. And it actually can invalidate the inferences when we have people doing that. And it's a real problem. It's something that comes, interestingly, from the two coasts primarily, that people go all the way through school, they're never in special education, they never get accommodations, and then they come up to needing a high school graduation test or a college admissions test, and suddenly they have a disability and they need an accommodation. So some research findings on accommodations. We know that large print works well. Read aloud, there are somewhat mixed findings. You can imagine I process in print much better than orally, and so we get some people to do that, frankly. If the student can control his or her own pacing, that helps them. More people with disabilities prefer paper and pencil than computer. I'm sure there's exceptions to that, but that is the general preference. And there's too few findings in using language simplification, but they often don't show differences. With regard to responses, extended time is the biggest issue. And these are fairly complex findings. And again, most of the findings are with college admissions tests. And there's an ability, we have to question whether the person has the ability to physically manipulate test materials. Sometimes people simply don't. Many people with disabilities want to be able to write in a multiple choice test the letter in the margin rather than filling in a box, because that's easier to do. Some people have the ability, if they have poor use of their hands, to write or to type can be difficult. So we have mixed results for marking in books. And then we have something called an amanuensis, or this is where you're dictating your answer to a scribe. Not done very often, but it does happen occasionally. And we have mixed findings on word processing as well. One of the biggest findings is that test scores for people with learning disabilities, where they mostly are asking for extra time, those test scores often overpredict their performance in educational settings. So that would be true with college admissions measures, that the test itself overpredicts to some extent. And it actually makes sense, because after all, the definition of a learning disability is that the person has higher ability than achievement. So as I said, it makes perfect sense. But what has been found is that if you should never use one test alone to make important decisions. We should use multiple measures whenever possible. And in college admissions, they don't only look at test grade scores, but they look at high school grades, for example. And when you combine in a multiple regression format grades and test scores, there is no overprediction. And that has been found in a number of settings, and it's a very useful finding. And of course, in any predictive study, and that's the best results that we have, I think, for checking the value of accommodations in terms of validity, is with grades. And that's where we have found very little problems with using accommodations for tests of admissions. There's a few legal standards that people need to know about. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was an important act that came out for higher education primarily. IDEA, again, in two forms, excuse me, came out and made requirements on education for people with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 and 2008, it was revised, has a lot to say about how we test people with disabilities. Now that's all incorporated into the standards for educational and psychological testing in its latest version. But under ADA, that should be on the slide, there is an accommodation. If there is to be an accommodation, the individual must request it, and they must, in many cases, provide documentation, medical tests, or some sort of test from educators. What also happens is, I know the College Board, for example, now keeps track of students who get an accommodation so that as they're taking other tests, it's in the record that they need a certain accommodation. And where we worry about this is with late changes. So if somebody has taken the test, has taken tests all through their career, and now suddenly they want an accommodation, that raises red flags. Now, if the student has just been in a car accident or had a stroke or something like that, that's not a problem. But it's where they say, oh, I've developed a learning disability, and they're in 12th grade in college, and they're taking the ACT or the SAT, then it's a question. Now, just to conclude, what I would say, and I consider one of the advantages of my history is I met George Herbert Walker Bush several times. I had a chance to converse with him. And if you go to his White House webpage that still exists, he lists ADA passing as one of the biggest things he did during his 4 years as president. And the goal is to mainstream students in schools and workers and people with disabilities to have normal lives, as normal as possible. And there's evidence that accommodations for tests, but in workplaces and in many other parts, have really led to people with disabilities being able to experience much more the joy of living and made them productive as well. And I happen to believe that testing and assessment can help this. Now, that's my full presentation. I'd be glad to answer questions if people wish to send them to me via email.